This video discusses correlations between the morphology and the chemical structure of calcium silicate hydrate as the calcium content changes. This work was mainly done by Elena Tajuelo at the University of Leeds. Elena investigated different methods to make synthetic CSH. We will discuss the two most important ones in the first part of this video. In its second part, we discuss the morphology of the product as the calcium to silicon ratio changes, and how the changes can be reflected to changes in the chemical structure according to the Richardson-Groves model. The first synthesis method discussed in this video is the mechanochemical method. All sample handling has to be done within a nitrogen-filled glove box to avoid carbonation. The synthesis is carried out within a ball mill. One mixes freshly degassed, deionized water with the solids at a water-to-solid ratio of about 8. Calcium oxide is added, which should be freshly prepared by thermal decomposition of calcium carbonate. Then silica is added. Two different types of silica were tried. Nanosilica produced by Alchem did not work well, but good results were obtained for substance marketed as aerosil. Lastly, a few ball mill pellets were added. The container was then sealed airtight and transferred to the ball mill, where it was milled using on-off cycles for 36 hours. The ball mill container was opened again within a nitrogen-filled glove box. The result of the reaction is a white, yogurt-like slurry, which was filtered through a Büchner funnel. The sample was dried in a nitrogen-flushed cylinder on a hot plate, still within the nitrogen atmosphere. A distillation bridge was used to condense the water. The samples were allowed to dry for 3 days at 60 degrees Celsius. The second method used is controlled hydration of tricalcium silicate. This means tricalcium silicate is hydrated at high water to solid ratio, here 50, at constant lime concentration in the solution. The device was developed by André Nonat, in whose lab the experiment was also carried out. It consists of a beaker which sits on a stirrer. It is controlled by a computer. A conductometer is used to measure the lime concentration in the solution. If the lime concentration increases due to the hydration of tricalcium silicate, pure water is automatically added by the computer. At the same time, the same amount of water is removed via a pump through a filter so that the water-to-solid ratio stays constant. To avoid blocking of the filter, it is flushed by nitrogen when the pump isn't working. The amount of water added is recorded and can be plotted against time. It looks like this. In Elena's thesis, it is discussed how this curve can be related to the degree of hydration. For the experiments carried out, tricalcium silicate was added with water and lime in the desired concentration at a water-to-solid ratio of 50. Note that to make solutions supersaturated with respect to portlandite, calcium oxide suspensions are used which are then filtered. Details are given in the thesis. 3 series were carried out. In series 1, the lime concentration was varied between 12 and 28 mmol per liter. The reaction was stopped twice, once during the acceleration period as shown and once during the deceleration period. The CSH and the morphology were then investigated. The second series used high lime concentrations, but an ultrasound probe was inserted into the reactor, and in the third series, Exceed, a synthetic CSH manufactured by BASF, was added. In this video, only the results of series 1 are discussed. Please look for the 2 other series in Elena's thesis, which can be found below this video on the Nanocem website. When the reaction was stopped, the mixture was filtered in a Büchner funnel and washed with ethanol water mixture and finally ethanol only. Eventually, it was dried for a day in a vacuum desiccator. On this slide, some of Elena's results on the synthetic CSH are discussed. We always compare the mechanochemically made samples in blue and the samples made by controlled hydration of tricalcium silicate in red. First, we look at the accessible calcium to silicon ratio. Its determination is not necessarily trivial, and we refer to Eleanor's thesis for details. The values given here were determined in a TEM with the EDX technique, and it was made sure that no traces of crystalline hydration products were present at these spots. In brackets, for the controlled hydration samples, a value from a thermodynamic model is given as well. Then we look at the morphology, how it changes with the calcium to silicon ratio, and lastly on the chemical units required in the Richardson-Groves model to describe the chemical composition. The Richardson-Groves model for itself deserves an own video, or maybe even two, and we refer to Richardson's papers and Eleanor's thesis for further details. It can be summarized like this. CSH is known to be like the mineral tobamorite, but in Portland cement, the calcium to silicon ratio is much higher than in tobamorite. To compensate for this fact, the tobamorite structure is modified by removal of silicon. When this is no longer possible, additional building blocks of the mineral gennite are introduced to push the calcium to silicon ratio even higher. On the Nanocem webpage below this video, we provide some links to publications of Ian Richardson about the Richardson-Groves model. The mechanochemically made samples could access calcium to silicon ratios between 0.75 and 1.33. Values below and above this range were not investigated. At the top end, Portland diet was precipitated during the synthesis. These values are below the values for the CSH found in Portland cement, but are typical values for CSH found in blended cement. As it can be seen on the micrograph, the resultant product for calcium to silicon ratio equals 0.75 has a foil-like morphology. Note the thin foils at the edge of the cluster. This is the same within the whole investigated range of calcium to silicon ratios, as can be seen for the top end at 1.33, which is also foil-like. If the Richardson-Groves model is applied, the chemical composition can be described solely by modified tobamorite-like units. The samples made by controlled hydration of calcium silicate had EDX values for the calcium to silicon ratio between 1.33 and 1.85. In the light of a thermodynamic model used to predict the calcium to silicon ratios as described in Eleanor's thesis, these values appear to be rather high. That's why, in brackets, the predicted values are given. These predicted values are closer to what is found in Portland cement. The reaction was always stopped at 2 points, during the acceleration period and the deceleration period, as shown here. The morphology appears to be foil-like for the lower end of the accessible calcium to silicon range. This does not change if the reaction is stopped at the later stage, as shown here. Thus, one conclusion is that the morphology does not depend on the state of the reaction. This in contrast to reports which observed foil-like CSH during the early stages of Portland cement hydration and fibrillar CSH during the later stages. Within the Richardson-Groves model, again, tobamorite-like units suffice to describe the chemical composition. If the calcium to silicon ratio increases, the morphology changes to this mix of foils and fibrils, which appears to be similar at both investigated points during the hydration reaction. If the calcium to silicon ratio is pushed up even higher, the morphology becomes fibrillar. Now, fibrils grow out of the cluster at the early stage, as shown here. This becomes even more pronounced at later stages. To the author of this video, these fibrils appear to be flat by themselves. Within the Richardson-Groves model, tobamorite and gennite units are needed to describe the chemical composition of CSH now. Looking at this total picture, it appears that the change in morphology coincides with the appearance of the gennite-like units. It should also be noted that the morphologies observed agree with those observed in cement systems. In blended systems such as slag cement, the calcium to silicon ratio is low and the morphology described as foil-like. In Portland cement with higher calcium to silicon ratio, the morphology is typically described as fibrillar. In this video we have learned about two different synthesis methods for CSH, about the change of morphology of the synthesized CSH with an increasing calcium content, which led to changes from fibrillar to foil-like growth, and finally how this change in the growth morphology can be correlated to chemical changes in the Richardson growth model. More interesting material can be found in analyses which could not be covered by this video. For example, how the morphology is affected by sonification during hydration. It is worth to have a look.